Thursday. It is May 13th, and we are learning the laws of kosher. We're doing the kosher crash course. You can find all previous classes at youtube.com/Jewish Gardens. That's youtube.com/Jewish Gardens. We are learning today a new section of kosher law, which is the laws of foods that are prepared by Gentiles. Are you allowed to eat food that's made by a non-Jew? Now, obviously, if it's not kosher, the answer is no. But the question is, if the food is kosher, and it was just made by a non-Jew, does that somehow affect its kosher status? The answer, Marty, is yes. Yep. What is the reason for this? This is a rabbinical prohibition. Look, when you say Talmud could be various kinds of reasons. The Talmud could be a Sinaitic law, which was received from God at Mount Sinai. It could be a rabbinical decree. It could be a custom. It could, just because it doesn't mean that it's one or the other. There's different kinds of laws. So this particular law is a rabbinical decree that the rabbis, the sages, forbid a Jew to eat food that was made by a non-Jew, and similarly baked by a non-Jew, even if the ingredients were kosher and even if the vessels in which it was prepared were also kosher. Now, obviously, if they weren't kosher, then it would be treif. But we're talking about a situation where the vessels are indeed kosher. The food ingredients are kosher, but what's not kosher is the fact that it was made by a Gentile. Now, there's two reasons for this. There's two reasons for this. One is by Rashi, and the other one is by Tosfos. They are like this. Number one is that we shouldn't become too close to accustomed to eating food by the Gentiles. In which case, today you might be eating kosher by the Gentile, but tomorrow it might not actually be kosher food. If you become too chummy, then it's very possible, that you always eat at a certain person's house. Then one day they don't have kosher ingredients, and you've got to check. A second problem, and probably more serious, is that when you eat to someone, when you break bread, you become very close to them, and that leads you to marriage. Pirkei Avot. I can't think of this. I can't think of a source right now in Ethics of the Fathers that you mentioned over there, Marty. But this is from the Talmud, where the Talmud states that if you eat with someone, well, there's an expression for this in English or in Hebrew, that when you break bread together, then you become friends, right? So if you get too close with the Gentiles by eating at their house, then what happens is it's very likely you'll end up intermarrying and assimilating, and that will be the end of your bloodline. I spent 3 hours yesterday talking to a young Jew, trying to convince him, he's deeply in love with a non-Jewish woman. And it was an interesting conversation, because I said to him, listen, are you ready for this to be the end of your entire line? Right? And he said, absolutely not. So he made up his mind. He said he's either going to go full-blown observant with her converting, or he's going to let it go. Tough choice, yeah. Go ahead, Keith.
So can a non-Jew come into your house, like a cook come into your house?
Oh, so that's a very interesting question now. So what happens about getting a chef? Can you get a chef to come to your kosher house and cook in your house? Seemingly, this would seem to apply. What happens if you have a housekeeper in your house? And what happens if she cooks for herself in your house with your dishes? So what happens now? I'm just going to plug my computer in. What happens now to the vessels inside of your... What is this? What happens to the vessels? Thank you. That are inside of your house, the dishes in your house, the food that she made inside of your house. Is it kosher or not? Okay. So here we go into the law. Thank you, Keith. Into extending these laws. Now, we will get into this momentarily, but to take it a little further, it is a kosher crash course. I'm going to keep it moving relatively quickly. Sages also prohibited, in addition to eating foods that were cooked or baked by Gentiles, also they prohibited wine that was touched by a non-Jew, milk that was milked by a non-Jew without the supervision of a Jew. And these laws will be detailed in the next few minutes, okay? Let's talk about breads. By the way, the answer to your question, Keith, in brief, is if a non-Jew was in your house cooking, then the answer is it's still a problem. Unless you were involved in some part of the process, unless there was a Jew involved in some part of the process. For example, in my house, the housekeeper knows that she is never, ever, ever, ever allowed to turn on the fires. Ever. She's never allowed to turn on the fires. So that way she knows that the fires to be turned on by someone, a Jewish resident of the house. I mean, she doesn't understand the reasons, but we don't get into that for her. But she'll ask a child or someone to turn on the fire, and that would preclude the prohibition because the fire was turned on by a Jew. We'll see that coming up soon. In other words, there's limitations to the prohibition which make it awkward and difficult enough to the point that we're not worried about the outcomes, right? Which is a good thing. It's a good thing that they did that, because otherwise, if they gave a blanket prohibition, it would be much more complicated, much more difficult way to live our lives. This way, for example, in a kosher bakery, where you have a non-kosher chef, right? Does this mean that we're only allowed to use chefs and bakers that are Jews? The answer is no, you don't have to, because there's ways around it. When I was in Italy, we went to an amazing bakery at 3:00 in the morning. We went there to turn on the fires, whatever, maybe 1:00 in the morning, whatever the time was. We went on to turn on the fires, and they were expecting us because they knew that when the Jews come to turn on the fire, then they're allowed to eat the bread for the next day because of the whole setup and the way it works. Go ahead, Keith.
What you just said brings up a point. Madison Square Garden, they had these kosher places to eat. However, like on one Sunday, they didn't have a rabbi come to turn on the fire, turn everything on. Mashiach come and turn everything on, so they couldn't actually cook anything that day.
Right. So Keith, for those that are listening online, so what Keith is telling me right now is that he's supporting what I'm saying, because he was at a Madison Square Garden and they have kosher eateries over there. But one day there was no kosher food because the guy didn't show up to turn on the fires. And therefore they couldn't make the food anymore. So that's true. By the way, you should know, in general, when you're at a wedding or at a bar mitzvah or at a restaurant, right? When you're, if you keep kosher, there's a likelihood that someone's going to come running out of the kitchen and say, everybody stop eating because the food is no longer kosher. Yeah, bear in mind. I mean, listen, if something fell into, a piece of cheese fell into the soup, the mashgiach discovers that they used the wrong spoon, for example. The whole thing could potentially become treif. And you say, everybody stop the soup. We're sending the waiters. We're getting the soup back in as treif, right? You got to be ready for that. You know, back in Africa, we were, my cousin was once in a restaurant and she was asking for mango juice. And the guy comes right back. He says, sorry, there's no mango juice because nobody climbed the tree today, right? No one climbed the tree today. So in the same manner that you don't have mango juice when nobody climbed the tree today, in a kosher diet, there's a high possibility that there'll be a recall at an event and say, listen, there's no steak tonight because, there was a kosher glitch, and therefore you got to pick something else. Good. Okay, so let's keep on going. Good morning, Dan Geiker, Cookie, Gottlieb, and Terry Zweig. Nice to see you both with us, all three of you, and Elaine and Winston, and everybody else that's with us here online, on YouTube, and on Facebook Live or later. Okay, so let's talk about the various categories. Let's break this down into the details. So we're talking about baked goods, right? Breads or foods that were baked, which were made out of the 5 grains. The 5 grains are always very, very important because the 5 grains are wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye. That was relating to the Passover story, to everything which is chametz. We spoke about this before Passover, that chametz is only made out of fermented grains, out of those 5 grains. That's what's considered grain in the Torah: wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye. Everything else is fake. Everything else is not really grain, right? Like legumes and rice and other stuff that they make breads out of, it's not considered a grain, right? So any of these 5 grains that were baked by a Gentile are not allowed to be eaten, and it doesn't make a difference what is the purpose of the bread. If it's a high, like a fancy kind of bread that was baked, or something that wasn't so fancy, but foods that were baked out of rice or millet or similar like that, baked by a Gentile, if it's not the 5 grains, then it is allowed to be eaten, obviously, as long as the ingredients are kosher. Now, if a Jew is a partner in the preparation of the dough or in the kneading of the dough, And then the Gentile proceeded to bake it himself. And even if the dough itself belonged to the Jew, and he just brought the Gentile to his house to bake it for him, right? Still, he's not allowed to eat from those foods. Right, unless he was right. So in other words, so helping to knead or helping to prepare the dough is not sufficient to be considered like you consider that you were part of the baking, unless you turn on the fire. Or and we're going to talk about some. So now we're going to talk about what are the categories that will preclude it from being considered baked exclusively by the Gentile. Right now, breads and baked foods that were baked by a Gentile, and the Jew made one of the following participations. For example, he turned on the oven, or he inserted the dough into the oven, or he increased the heat of the fire. If it was already on and he increased the heat of the fire. In those cases, then you are allowed to eat from those breads or baked goods. Why? Because they were made in a manner where there is a clear recognition that you're not allowed to eat from foods that are baked by Gentiles. In other words, this is not going to lead to intermarriage. This is not going to lead to being too reliant on them, because this is such a headache. To say, oh yeah, I eat in that person's house as long as I turn on the fire, put the bread in, or if I increase the heat. It doesn't work that way. Normally you eat by someone's house, you come in, you come to the dining, go to the kitchen, right? But if you have to go into the kitchen, then it already becomes like, there's a certain barrier, a trust barrier, which is a wall, and that precludes the problem from continuing. Let me just finish this paragraph, Keith, before we take the questions. Hold on a second. So furthermore, dough that was kneaded and baked by the Gentile, and during the baking, the Jew came, and while it's in the fire, he increased the fire, even if the face of the bread was already hardened, from the baking, it's still fine. It's still fine as long as at some point to increase the fire. When you have gas or electric, which the Jew lit at the beginning of the day. In restaurants today, there's a pilot light that takes it takes 10, 15 minutes to turn the thing on. I'm not sure exactly how that works and why it takes 15 minutes to turn on the pilot light in some of these restaurants with these very, very heavy ovens, like big, heavy duty commercial ovens. I remember when we had a restaurant over here, it takes them a while to turn on the oven, but the mashgiach will come in and he'll do that first thing in the morning, right? So if he did it at the beginning of the day and all day long it was burning from the fire that was turned on by the Jew, and the Gentile throughout the day was baking various foods in there, that is okay. It's good, and you're allowed to eat all the baked goods that came out of that fire, because again, that fire was turned on by the Jew, even if it was at the beginning. There is interesting here. This is where kosher certification agencies start to differ. When you have the OK, the OU, the CRC, you have different interpretations of the law and applications of the law, because a lot of them pertain to foods that were baked by Gentiles, in the sense as follows. So what classifies the involvement of a Jew? We're speaking very general terms right now, but there is something called I forget what it's called, like this little, like a little probe inside of the fire, inside of the oven, and it burns forever. You can put like a little stick of heat, something which emits heat. I forget what it's called, like a electric something, and it increases the heat inside of the oven a little bit, right? Let's say 1 degree, and it just sits there, and that's like it's got a switch, and the Jew turns it on. It's on. So some sort of kosher certification agencies will consider that sufficient to be considered involving of a Jew, even though the fire wasn't turned on by the Jew, but it was the heat was increased by the Jew, even though it was 6 weeks ago and it's still there. The fact that it was turned on by a Jew, that's already considered participation. Other ones might not consider that sufficiently kosher to make it a involvement of a Jew. So all of this stuff is the nuance between the various, the various kosher certification agencies. Now, it might sound a little benign when you look at it from this angle, but think of it this way, So you might have different attorneys. Think of it, different attorneys. Let's take it to American law, right? And different attorneys have different comfort levels in terms of aggression, right? This one feels that it's okay to speak with chutzpah to the judge, and this one thinks it's not okay to speak with chutzpah to the judge. This one let you do that, to do certain things, and now, or accountants, right? Your accountant here might let you do certain things that another accountant might not let you do, right? right? So it all depends on comfort levels. You were going to say something, Keith, though.
Actually, that's my question.
Oh, I did answer your question. Very fantastic. Good. So it's got a lot to do at the end of the day with your yiras shamayim, with your fear of heaven. Do you see the laws of Torah as merely headaches, which need to be anesthetized, or do you see them as opportunities to show your love to your Father in heaven? So if you see a mitzvah as a headache, you're looking for any opportunity to get out of the way. But if you see a mitzvah as an opportunity to show your love, like taking out the garbage. When you take out the garbage from the kitchen, do you do that because it's a chore? Or do you do it because it shows your spouse that you love her? Right? It's all in your head. It's all a matter of perspective, right? So, you could be carrying a bag of, there's a nice story of a guy carrying a heavy bag of rocks every day. He goes up the mountain and he does it with alacrity and joy, right? So one day somebody asks him, like, well, why are you so happy to be schlepping all this heavy load? He says, yeah, if you knew what was inside my bag, you would also be doing with alacrity and joy. And he shows him the bag. It's full of diamonds, right? So I'm carrying diamonds. I'm excited. I'm happy. Right, I'm carrying my own wealth. If I'm schlepping someone else's, garbage, then I'd probably be less excited. But when you realize that what you're doing in the laws of kosher is an opportunity to connect to the Master of the universe, with our Father in heaven, to become one with God Almighty, and then you see every opportunity to do a mitzvah is something that you pounce upon and take advantage of to show Hashem your love. You're not looking for the shortcuts, right? Now, an oven that was turned on by a Jew with wood at the beginning of the day, and during the day, the Gentile added in more wood in order to keep the fire burning. It's wood, right? So it's the same fire as before, but it's new wood, new fuel. And he cooked different cycles of foods in there. You are allowed to eat whatever he baked in there, in that oven, as long as there are still burning coals from the original fire that the Jew lit. It's you have a wood fire, right? Obviously. Now, what about in extraneous circumstances? Extraneous circumstances would be like this. So the midas chasidus is an interesting term. The way of the pious, of chasidim. A chasid is someone who does kindness to his creator, somebody who loves his creator, who serves God out of love and not out of duty, right? Out of love and not out of discipline. So someone who has a midas chasidus, a loving approach to Hashem, should be careful not to eat at all from the foods that were baked by Gentiles. But according to the strict letter of the law, if you are in a place where there is no foods that were baked by Jews, there are those that are lenient to eat from foods that were baked by Gentiles for the purposes of selling them. But certainly not foods baked by Gentiles for their own selves or for their own homes. So food that was baked by a Gentile, breads that were baked by a Gentile for himself, you're never allowed to eat. But if you baked it for the purposes of sale, like in a non-kosher bakery, if you know for sure that the ingredients are kosher and the vessels have not been used for anything else, somehow, if you know that for sure, then according to the strict letter of the law, you would be allowed to eat that food that was baked by the Gentile, as long as it was baked for the purposes of selling it and not for his personal needs. But you do need to make sure that the ingredients were kosher and that there's no concern of oils. They use oils to, like the non-stick spray, and they smear it down with animal fats that would make it 100% treif. You could be eating bread made out of flour and water, but if the racks were sprayed with animal fats, with lard, then it's 100% treif. It's lard. It's bacon.
That's why years ago you couldn't buy aluminum foil without.
Why? How did they make aluminum foil?
With lard.
They sprayed it with lard.
They sprayed with lard.
Very good.
Aluminum foil. They sprayed it. I'm telling you, Marty, you had to buy aluminum foil with a hechsher on it.
So Steve is pointing out that in times gone by, you had to buy aluminum foil with a kosher certification stamp. And even today, you'll see aluminum foil, some, especially during Passover time, has kosher certification stamps because they make it with all sorts of starches. And in Pesach, starch is 100% treif. So you got to be careful because starch is chametz, right? So you got to be careful that there's no mixed in oils or some other mixtures of prohibition. For example, Cuban bread, they make it with lard, right? So you got to be careful that it's got no other mixtures in it and that it was made in kosher vessels. In vessels that were, let's say, specific, very, very specific to only this kind of bread, for example, right? So that's from the strict letter of the law. Now, there are those who are even more lenient to eat foods baked by the Gentile, even if there are kosher bakeries around you, Jewish bakeries around you, if those foods baked by the Gentiles are better or more refined than those in the Jewish bakery. Now, again, if you look into cut corners, and there is a way for you to, to shave it down to the lowest possible restriction level. But there is a midas chasidus, a way of, way of showing love to your Creator, to your Father in heaven, by being more strict and more careful with these things. We in our house, for example, and in our shul, we only eat bishul Yisrael, which is bread that was baked by a Jew. We, under no circumstances, ever eat breads that were baked by a Gentile, no matter where we are, no matter what the circumstance.
What I was going to say is that if you were starving to live, you would have to eat bread.
Okay, so you're saying like this. You're asking if your life is in danger. If your life is in danger, would you eat bread? I'd eat pig if I needed to if my life was in danger. I wouldn't eat a cockroach, I didn't think, no. But I don't know. It depends how bad it would be. I don't know. But that's if your life is in danger. If your life is in danger, there's a lot of things you're allowed to do. Pikuach nefesh, it comes in for everything, except for the top 3 sins. But when it comes to regular life, which is 99.99999% of the time, then you are indeed allowed, under certain circumstances, to buy bread or baked goods that were baked by a Gentile. But it all depends on your yiras shamayim, your fear of heaven, and your personal standards. Right, which is why there's many standards in kosher. People tell me, Rabbi, come to my house, you can eat in my house, it's kosher. And I don't doubt that they're being sincere, but there's, with all due respect, there's many levels of kosher, most of which you're probably not aware of. And that's why I wouldn't eat in that person's house, because, there's certain sensitivities that they're simply not aware of, and for no ill intention. But just, something like this, right? A person who finds himself in a place where there is no other food, and there's not even a non-kosher bakery. There are those that allow him to eat from baked goods that were baked by a Gentile for himself and for his family, on condition that he makes sure that there's no mixture of anything else prohibited. Because the problem is, when you go to someone's house, you don't know what's going on in there, right? At least in a commercial setting, it's like a little more, controlled. But in someone's house, you have absolutely no idea what goes on over there. It's not controlled in any sense. For according to the letter of the law, the strict letter of the law, you should be careful to avoid eating baked goods by Gentiles on Shabbos. So even if you go by the leniencies mentioned above, you should be careful that the meals of Shabbos should be foods baked by a Jew. Certainly not the challah, exactly. Even those, you shouldn't even eat from Gentiles that bake those challahs or baked goods for Shabbos, even if they bake them commercially to sell. Ideally, the best thing is to make your own challahs in honor of Shabbos, especially one should be careful not to eat these Gentile baked foods during the 10 days of Teshuvah between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So it's definitely a higher standard of holiness, right? Is it treif? Not necessarily a treif. But is it more holy? Definitely, right?
No one can bake challah.
No one can bake challah like my chana. That's true.
The best challah ever tasted.
Thank you. We always say the challah tastes like the guests. When we have good guests, the challah tastes amazing. So every time you come, it tastes amazing.
Doesn't that apply when we're speaking specifically, let's say, about challah? Anything that is kashur mebchina, kodesh,
yeah,
because it was used in the Beis Hamikdash, you have to be more machmir, don't you?
I'm not sure what you're saying though. Well, I'm going to repeat the question in a second online.
Well, you're talking about bread.
Bread, yeah.
Okay, and you said it depends on the level of Yirat Shamayim. Okay, but for example, bread and wine and.
Are you saying that there's a higher standard to anything that was in the temple?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that connection. Okay. For example, milk wasn't in the temple. And we were very careful with milk. So I'm not sure what you're basing that on. I'm not familiar. with that distinction. Let's go a little bit further into foods that were cooked by a Gentile. We spoke about baking. Let's move on into foods that were cooked by a Gentile. Our sages prohibited us to eat foods that were cooked by a Gentile for the concern that the Gentile will feed us something which is prohibited, or that we might come to marry them, as mentioned earlier. Including in this prohibition of cooking is frying, deep frying, and baking, right? But other foods that were prepared for eating through by a Gentile through processes such as salting, or soaking, or drying. For example, in South Africa, we have I think they call it in America beef jerky, but in South Africa it's called biltong. Biltong is dried meat, right? If it was like smoked or dried, then seemingly that would be okay to be eaten. Even if it wasn't cooked or smoked or or dried by a Jew. If it was done by a Gentile, that would not be included in the prohibition. Furthermore, food which was never on the fire, and the Gentile basically cooked it by pouring in boiling water, right? Those tradition soups. Ramen, yeah, is that what it's called? Yeah, so you have these cooked soups that you just pour like hot water into it, right? That is also not considered food cooked by a Gentile, and you're also allowed to eat it, right? If the Gentile heated up a food that was already cooked by a Jew, he just put it in the microwave, right? Just heat it up, you are allowed to eat it, and there's no prohibition of being cooked by a Gentile. Now, when are we allowed to eat foods that were cooked by a Gentile? A Gentile is cooking in the house of a Jew. There has to be the presence of one of the people of the house at the time of the cooking, and it's enough that he's going in and out, that the Jew has access, and that the way the Gentile knows that at any moment someone is able to come in and interrupt his privacy, right? So that way he's cognizant of the fact that he's better watch what he's doing, and therefore you're allowed to eat that food baked by the Gentile in the house of the Jew, cooked by the Gentile in the house of the Jew, under one of the following conditions: if the Jew puts the food on the fire, or if he lights the fire. Right? Very similar to what we learned before. Okay, a Gentile who's cooking in his own house, it won't help for the Jew to light the fire in the Gentile's house. In such a case, the Jew has to actually put the food on the fire. It's like a higher standard of cognizance, because you're in his house. See, because then you'll turn on the fire and then disappear. Go to the office for a couple hours and come back. Here you got to put the food on the fire, so he's aware that you're watching every. Well, assuming you're talking about a kosher vessel, because if you're not talking about a kosher vessel, then there's nothing to talk about. You got other problems, right? A dish that was cooked by the Gentile and it was already fully cooked. You're not allowed to eat from that food, and it's not going to help you to increase the fire or to take the food off the fire and to put it back onto the fire, because it's already cooked. In the same way we said before, when a Gentile heats a cooked food, it's okay. Here too, the flip side is when the food is already cooked by the Gentile and you want to now put it back on the fire somehow to make it cooked by a Jew, it doesn't help. But if it wasn't fully cooked yet, and then the Jew increased the fire, or he took it off the fire and put it back onto the fire, then the Jew is allowed to eat it, because in such a case, the Jew was intrinsically involved with the cooking, right? But foods that were able to be eaten without being cooked at all, foods that are able to be eaten raw.
Sashimi, sushi.
Well, is sashimi raw fish, or do they do anything to it?
Raw. Even sushi.
Seriously?
Sushi's raw too. Most of it. Some is not. Oh, that's.
They do nothing to sashimi?
Yeah. Raw fish rolled with rice.
How is that even healthy?
Not with rice.
How is it even healthy to eat raw fish?
That's why pregnant women are not supposed to eat sushi.
Kills a lot of bacteria?
Because parasites in uncooked fish.
What kind of parasites?
Parasites in the water. There are parasites in the fish.
In the water. That's very interesting, because we learned in the laws of insects that there are stuff in the water. If they don't leave the water, it's fine. But if they leave the water, then it's a problem.
You don't see it, but it's in there.
Very interesting. So that would align very well with what we learned in the laws of insects. Anyways, so foods that may be eaten raw. fruits, for example, right? And then they were cooked.
Believe it or not, there are meat dishes also that are eaten.
And then they were cooked, right? Or foods which are not able to be served on royal tables. There are certain foods that are not worthy of royal tables. Potato chips, falafel, right? I've never seen in the table of Queen Elizabeth falafel. In a pita.
Potato chips, that's pretty good.
Potato chips is pretty good. Well, it's not considered royal foods. In such cases, we will talk about those applications of the law next week. So there's a very important distinction about foods. Basically, the prohibition only applies to foods that are worthy of being placed on the royal tables, and not on foods that don't go on royal tables, right? So, for example, mushrooms, can't eat them raw, right?
I eat them.
You can't eat them raw?
Salad.
Fine, but since fine, so a food that can be eaten raw would not be included in the prohibition of Gentile cooking, and also food that can not be served at a royal table, also like sloppy joes. I mean, just the name sloppy joe. You know what sloppy joe is?
Yeah.
It's sloppy. I can't imagine Queen Elizabeth eating a sloppy joe. You know what I mean? Maybe she might have a better name for it. I don't know. But yeah, we're having sloppy joes tonight at the royal state dinner. You know.
Lovely.
Oh, lovely, right? It does, you know what I'm saying?
Well, I mean, yeah, but wait a minute. What about things like that need much more attention, like lettuce and other things like that, even though they're not cooked?
Again, okay, so just to repeat the question, we're asking a question, Steve's asking a question about food that needs more attention, like lettuce, which needs to be checked for insects, right? The whole discussion today is only relating to assuming everything else is taken care of somehow, right? Because if you're having a problem with whether the lettuce itself or the pot itself is known to be non-kosher, there's nothing you can do that's not going to help you if the Gentiles or the Jews cooking it. It's not going to help you. Even if a Jew cooks it, it's treif, right? Hannah is asking a question: is OU a good kosher certification for challah? So OU means that it's kosher, but it's got to say on it, Hannah, Pas Yisrael. Pas Yisrael means bread of a Jew. Pas Yisrael means bread that was baked by a Jew. And you got to look out for that. You'll see, I believe, the Publix brand of challah, the brand they sell in challah. I forget what the name of the brand is. You know?
I don't know what the brand is, but it's only a certain, they don't bake it at the Publix.
It's not the regular brand,
Not the regular Publix.
but they sell it at Publix. It's like
And
comes
it
from
does
another
say
factory.
Pas Yisrael.
It says it's got a kosher certification on it, and it says Pas Yisrael, bread baked by a Jew, and that's the one that we buy. If Hannah didn't bake challah that week, but we don't bake challah, so we don't eat challah, which doesn't say Pas Yisrael on it.
OU is not good.
If it doesn't say Pas Yisrael, it's not good enough.
Why would OU even certify that?
So that's an interesting question. So why would OU certify something if it's not Pas Yisrael? In the same reason that most of the kosher products out there, the dairy ones, are kosher, but they're not Chalav Yisrael, they're not milked by a Jew. Right? Why would they certify it? Well, they figure like this: even though we can't get the highest standard, at least that's better than nothing. So you know, a regular Jew that comes to Publix, right? They figure like this: he might not be able to keep every stringency of the law, but at least let's give him options. So instead of buying the treif milk, let him buy the kosher milk, even if it's not the highest standard of kosher milk. And that's the ideology here. All right, that's what they decided to do. Now, certain kosher agencies would never even think of doing that. They say, go big or go home. Either we're doing it properly or we're doing nothing at all. And there you get differences between certain kosher agencies, where some feel that others are being too lax or too progressive or too liberal, whereas others feel that some others are being too extreme. Whatever. It all depends on your personal Yiras Shamayim, your awe of heaven. Hannah, I don't understand your question. Challah and other bread. Well, yeah, I think I would have answered that it depends, Hannah, on it would apply to challah and any other bread. Anything which is baked would need to be Pas Yisrael, would need to be baked by a Jew. Winston, is a kosher certification for the vaccine or medicine? Some medicines do. Now, that's a very interesting. It's a very interesting category, section of the law, that medicines in general are not really eaten; they're ingested. If you have a kosher alternative, you should go for the kosher alternative. But like Pfizer, there's no Jewish company, there's no Moshe's Goldstein's making a version of the vaccine. And if there was one, I probably wouldn't take it either. But the thing is, to answer this question, is that when it's something which is life-saving, then you don't have to worry about it. Like the vaccine, especially if it's not ingested orally, it's like it's put into your arm. That's not something which you have to worry about. But if you know that what you're eating is a non-kosher pill, the gelatin or something on the pill, then what you do is you can actually wrap it up in a piece of lettuce or a tissue and swallow it up that way, so it doesn't actually touch your throat. And that is a sort of leniency. We'll talk about that when we get there in the laws of kosher.
I also was the chief operating officer of a pharmaceutical company for a few years.
Okay.
And we had a kosher line of medication, prescription medication, liquid medications that were all kosher.
Okay, fine. So
came in and actually
Marty says he was a CEO of a COO of a big pharmaceutical company, and they had a line of kosher certified items. And it's very important. Today, it's a very extensive business. So you can actually ask. You can ask if there's an alternative, especially in the vitamins. The vitamins, because vitamins are not essential. And this is very important. Vitamins are different than medicines. Medicines can be life-saving. And they would mean that pikuach nefesh, the law of saving a life, takes precedence, especially if you have no alternative. But when it comes to vitamins, just to give you a little extra boost, there you've got to be more cognizant, because you can't say, well, there's no kosher alternative. Look around. And if there's a kosher alternative, there probably is one, right? There's a lot of these kosher medicine companies. I don't know if they call Liebers or whatever they're called. There are kosher companies. You can just search it online. I'm sure an easy search online will find you the kosher medicine companies, kosher vitamin companies.
You can always get the list of the vitamins.
And they're all out there. And there's lists out there about kosher certified vitamins. We'll get there in due time. Anyways, thank you very much for joining me this morning. Today's Thursday. Tonight at 7:30 p.m., I'm giving a class on the purpose of creation. It is part of our Mashiach course. This can happen. The Jewish belief in Mashiach. Feel free to join us at jewishgardens.com/RSVP. That's jewishgardens.com/RSVP to join us for tonight's class. And also at 11:30, Corey gives a class on Hebrew language through the prayer book for men and women on Zoom, jewishgardens.com/Zoom. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining me today. Shalom and have a wonderful day.
Shalom.
Chazak. So we didn't have anything too controversial today, right?